What if I told you an 18-year-old kid from Illinois built an engine for $85 that humiliated Ford's most feared muscle car? Not with some exotic race motor or factory backing, but with junkyard parts and an idea that Pontiac engineers said wouldn't work. Picture this. It's 1970, and you're at a drag strip in central Illinois. A primer gray Firebird rolls up to the line next to a 428 Cobra Jet Mustang. The Ford owner's probably thinking this is going to be easy money. The Mustang's packing Ford's ultimate street weapon, 335 advertised horsepower, though everyone knew it was really making closer to 410. The Firebird? Some kid's daily driver, with what sounds like a small block under the hood. The tree drops. Both cars launch hard. But by the 60-foot mark, something's wrong. The Firebird's pulling away. By the 8th mile, it's a car length ahead. When the time slips come back, nobody can believe it. The kid in the Firebird just ran a 12:40 quarter mile. The Cobra Jet? 12:82. This is the story of Jim Wangers Jr., the Illinois mechanic who discovered something Pontiac didn't want anyone to know. Their cheapest, most overlooked engine could be turned into a giant killer for less than the cost of a tank of gas and dinner for two. To understand why this matters, we need to travel back to the late 1960s. The muscle car wars were at their peak. Manufacturers were locked in a cubic inch arms race. Bigger was always better. More displacement meant more power, and more power meant more sales. At least, that's what everyone believed. Ford had their 428 Cobra Jet, a 7-points roll-leader monster that dominated both the streets and the strip. Chevrolet had the legendary 454. Chrysler was dropping 440s and 426 Hemis into anything with wheels. And Pontiac? They were pushing their 400 and 455 big blocks hard, marketing them as the only real performance option. The thing about these big blocks was they weren't just powerful. They were expensive. A properly built 455 Pontiac could easily set you back $2,000 in 1970 money. That's about $15,000 today. Factory performance packages cost even more. The Ram Air 4400, Pontiac's top dog, was a $600 option. That's over $4,000 in today's money, just for the engine upgrade. But buried in Pontiac's lineup was the 326 cubic inch small block. Introduced in 1963, it was never meant to be a performance engine. Pontiac marketed it as an economy option for customers who wanted a V8 but didn't need big block power. It came in base model Tempests and Le Mans. Nobody was supposed to race them. They were grocery getters, commuter cars, the engine you bought when you couldn't afford the good stuff. The 326 was essentially a destroked 389, sharing the same 4.06-inch bore, but with a shorter 3.25-inch stroke compared to the 389's 3.75 inches. This gave it 326 cubic inches of displacement. In stock form, it made a whopping 250 horsepower with a 2-barrel carburetor, or 285 with a 4-barrel. Not exactly earth-shattering numbers. But here's what Pontiac didn't advertise. All their V8s from 326 to 455 shared the same basic architecture, same bore spacing, same bell housing bolt pattern, same motor mount locations, and most importantly, the same cylinder head bolt pattern. This was unique to Pontiac. While Ford and Chevy had completely different small block and big block designs, Pontiac built everything on the same foundation. Enter Jim Wangers Jr. No relation to Jim Wangers, the Pontiac marketing executive who helped create the GTO. This Wangers was just a kid from Illinois who worked at a local speed shop and spent his weekends at the drag strip. He didn't have money for a big block, but he understood engines. More specifically, he understood airflow. Wangers had been studying Pontiac engines and noticed something interesting. The 389 and 400 cylinder heads flowed significantly better than the 326 heads. The ports were larger, the valves were bigger, and the combustion chambers were designed for performance. The 326 heads, by contrast, were restrictive. They were designed for fuel economy and low-end torque, not high RPM breathing. But if all Pontiac V8s shared the same architecture, what would happen if you bolted big block heads onto a small block? The compression ratio would jump because the 389 heads had larger combustion chambers designed for a longer stroke engine. Put them on a short stroke 326, and the pistons would come up higher in the chambers. Higher compression meant more power, assuming you could feed it high enough octane fuel. In early 1970, Wangers decided to find out. He went to a local junkyard and found a 326 from a wrecked 1967 Tempest. $40. The engine had 78,000 miles on it, but it still had good compression. He pulled it, took it back to his garage, and tore it down. The bottom end was actually in decent shape. The crank journals were within spec, the cylinder walls showed normal wear, and the pistons were serviceable. Wangers honed the cylinders, installed new rings, and replaced the rod and main bearings. Total cost for the refresh, about $20 in parts. Then came the heads. Wangers found a pair of 1967 389 heads at a swap meet. Number 16 castings, nothing special. The seller wanted $30. Wangers talked him down to $25, but threw in another $5 for a used Ram Air camshaft the guy had lying around. The 389 heads had 2.11-inch intake valves and 1.77-inch exhaust valves compared to the 326's 1.92-inch and 1.66-inch valves. The ports were significantly larger, and the combustion chambers were 72 cc's compared to the 326's 62 cc chambers. When Wangers did the math, he figured the compression ratio would come out to about 10.51, high but manageable with good gas. The Ram Air Cam was the real secret weapon. It was a hydraulic unit from a 1969 Ram Air 3 400 with 288 degrees of advertised duration and 0.520-inch lift with 1.5.1 rockers. Way more aggressive than anything Pontiac ever put in a 326. The cam had seen better days, but the lobes were still good. Assembly was straightforward but precise. Wangers degreed the cam to make sure it was perfectly timed. He port-matched the intake manifold to the larger head ports. He found a used Cobra Jet carburetor from a 1969 GTO and rebuilt it, rejetting it slightly richer to handle the increased airflow. The exhaust was a mix of junkyard finds, Ram Air exhaust manifolds from a wrecked GTO, which flowed much better than the restrictive 326 manifolds, dual 2.25-inch pipes running to turbo mufflers. Nothing fancy, but functional. When Wangers fired up the engine for the first time, it sounded different than any 326 anyone had heard. It had that distinctive Pontiac rumble, but with a sharper edge. The idle was lumpy from the aggressive cam, and it wanted to rev. The 389 heads and Ram Air Cam had completely transformed the engine's personality, but sound was one thing, power was another. Wangers didn't have access to a dyno, but he had something better, the drag strip. He dropped the engine into his 1968 Firebird, a basic model he'd bought for $600. The car was nothing special. Bench seat, 3-speed automatic, 3.23 rear gears. It still had the spare tire in the trunk. His first passes were promising. The car would spin the tires hard off the line, something it had never done with the stock 326. The engine pulled hard to 6,000 RPM, where the stock motor would have been gasping for air by 4,500. But the real test would come when he lined up against serious competition. The opportunity came at Byron Dragway in northern Illinois. A group of Ford guys from Chicago showed up with a collection of Cobra Jet Mustangs. These weren't stock cars. They had headers, slicks, and gear changes. They were running high 12s and low 13s, respectable times for street-driven cars in 1970. Wangers knew his Firebird was quick, but the Cobra Jets were legendary. The 428 was Ford's answer to the muscle car wars. It used a massive 4.13-inch bore and 3.98-inch stroke, to achieve 428 cubic inches. The heads flowed well, and the engine made tremendous torque. In Super Cobra Jet form, with a drag pack, it was virtually unbeatable in stock eliminator racing. When Wangers rolled up to the staging lanes in his primer gray Firebird, the Ford guys barely noticed. Just another Pontiac small block, they figured. Probably a 350 or maybe a mild 400. Nobody suspected what was really under the hood. The first race was against a yellow 1969 Mach 1. The Ford had every advantage: better tires, lower gears, and supposedly more power. When the tree dropped, both cars launched hard, but by the time they crossed the finish line, Wangers was a car length ahead. Time slip 12:40 at 108 miles per hour. The Cobra Jet ran 12:75 at 105. Word spread quickly through the pits. The Ford guys wanted another shot. This time, they brought out their fastest car, a black 1970 Mustang with the drag pack option, 430. Gears and Detroit locker differential. The owner claimed it had never lost to a Pontiac. The race was even closer. The Mustang got a better launch, pulling ahead by half a car length. But as the engines wound out through the gears, Wangers 326 started gaining. By the 1,000-foot mark, they were dead even. At the finish line, Wangers won by a fender, 12:38 to 12:51. The Ford guys demanded to see what was under the hood. When Wangers popped it open, they couldn't believe it. The valve covers said 326. The block was clearly a small journal unit, but this thing was pulling like a big block. They accused him of cheating, of somehow sneaking in a 389 or 400. Wangers offered to pull ahead right there in the pits to prove it was a 326 bore and stroke. They declined but left the track thoroughly confused. What Wangers had discovered was something that wouldn't become common knowledge in the Pontiac world for years. The cylinder head is the most important component in making power. You can have all the cubic inches in the world, but if the heads can't flow enough air, you're leaving power on the table. The 326 with 389 heads was flowing as much air as many big blocks. The smaller displacement actually helped in some ways. The shorter stroke meant the engine could rev higher without excessive piston speed. The lighter rotating assembly meant it revved quicker. And the high compression from the head swap meant it was extracting maximum energy from every combustion cycle. Let's talk about the technical details that made this combination work. The stock 326 heads flowed about 185 CFM on the intake side at 0.500-inch lift. The 389 heads flowed 230 CFM at the same lift. That's a 24% increase in airflow. In the world of naturally aspirated engines, airflow equals power potential. The compression ratio increase was even more significant. The stock 326 with its small chamber heads ran about 86.1 compression. With the 389 heads, Wangers was seeing 10.5 in 1. Every point of compression ratio is worth roughly 3 to 4% more power, all else being equal. So just from the compression increase, he was looking at a 6 to 8% power gain. But the real magic was in the combination. The high compression made the engine more efficient at part throttle, improving throttle response. The bigger valves and ports allowed the engine to keep making power at high RPM, and the ram air camshaft had the duration and lift to take advantage of all that airflow. Wangers estimated his engine was making around 425 horsepower at 5,800 RPM and 410 lb-ft of torque at 4,200 RPM. These were big block numbers from 326 cubic inches. For comparison, a stock Ram Air 3 400 was rated at 366 horsepower. Wangers' Junkyard 326 was outpowering Pontiac's premium performance engine. The beauty of the build was its simplicity. No expensive machine work, no exotic parts. Everything was either junkyard salvage or swap meet finds. The total investment was $85, $40 for the core engine, $30 for the heads, $15 for the cam. In today's money, that's about $630. Try building anything that makes 425 horsepower for that price today. But here's where it gets interesting. Pontiac knew this was possible. Their engineers understood that the 326 and 350 small blocks could make serious power with the right heads and cam. But they never promoted it. Why? Money. Pontiac made huge profits on their big block performance engines. The 400 and 455 engines were expensive to produce, but commanded premium prices. A Ram Air 400 was a $600 option. The cylinder heads alone were works of art. Massive ports, huge valves, and extensive hand porting from the factory. Pontiac could charge whatever they wanted for these engines because customers believed they needed them for performance. If word got out that a junkyard 326 with swap meat heads could match or beat these expensive engines, it would hurt sales. Why would anyone pay $600 for a Ram Air 4 when they could build something faster for $85? Pontiac's performance image was built on their big blocks, the GTO, the Trans Am, the Formula, all marketed with 400 and 455 power. There was also the insurance issue. By 1970, insurance companies were cracking down on muscle cars. Rates were astronomical for anything with a big block. But a 326, that was an economy engine. Insurance companies charged standard rates. Kids like Wangers could actually afford to insure their cars. Wangers wasn't the only one to figure this out, but he was one of the first to prove it publicly. After word spread about his Byron Dragway victories, other racers started experimenting with small block Pontiac combinations. The 350, which replaced the 326 in 1968, became especially popular. It had the same 3.88-inch bore as the 400, meaning it could use the same pistons and valves. Within a year, the small block Pontiac movement was growing. Racers discovered that 350s with 400 or 455 heads made tremendous power. The combination of big block heads, high compression, and aggressive camshafts turned these economy engines into giant killers. Some builders were seeing 450-500 horsepower from 350 cubic inches. The technical reasons why this worked so well are fascinating. Pontiac's engine architecture was unique in the muscle car era. Unlike Chevy, which had completely different small block and big block designs, or Ford with their multiple engine families, Pontiac built everything on the same basic block. The deck height was the same from 326 to 455. The bore centers were identical. The main bearing saddles were the same size. This meant incredible interchangeability. A 455 crank would drop into a 326 block. 400 heads would bolt onto a 350. Ram Air exhaust manifolds from a GTO would fit a Tempest. This was intentional. It made manufacturing easier and cheaper. But it also created possibilities Pontiac never advertised. The cylinder head flow was the key to everything. In the late 1960s, most manufacturers were fixated on displacement. Bigger bores and longer strokes were the path to power, or so they thought. But airflow is what actually makes power. An engine is just an air pump. The more air you can move through it, the more fuel you can burn, and the more power you can make. Pontiac's big block heads were excellent. The 1969-1970 Ram Air 4 heads flowed over 270 CFM on the intake side. The 1971-1972 455 HO heads flowed 250 CFM. Even the standard 389 and 400 heads flowed 230, 240 CFM. These were impressive numbers for production heads. But here's the thing. A 326 or 350 small block doesn't need as much airflow as a 455. The relationship between airflow and displacement isn't linear. A smaller engine with excellent heads will make more power per cubic inch than a larger engine with restrictive heads. This is exactly what Wangers proved. His 326 with 389 heads was making about 1.3 horsepower per cubic inch. A stock 455 with the same quality of build would make about 1.0 horsepower per cubic inch. The smaller engine was more efficient. It had less reciprocating mass, less friction, and could rev higher safely. The compression ratio was another crucial factor. In 1970, you could still buy 100-plus octane fuel at many stations. Sunoco 260 was readily available and cost only a few cents more than regular. This allowed builders to run compression ratios that would be impossible today without race fuel. Wangers' 10.5.1 compression was actually conservative. Some builders were running 11.1 or even 12.1 on the street with careful tuning. Every point of compression added power, and with the right cam timing and carburetor jetting, detonation could be controlled. The ram air camshaft was the final piece of the puzzle. Pontiac's performance cams were excellent, with aggressive profiles that took advantage of the good head flow. The Ram Air 3 cam that Wangers used was actually relatively mild by racing standards, but in a high-compression small block with good heads, it was perfect. The cam's 208 degrees of advertised duration and .520-inch lift kept the valves open long enough and far enough to fill and empty the cylinders efficiently at high RPM. The stock 326 cam had only 273 degrees of duration and 400-inch lift, fine for a grocery getter, but hopeless for performance. What made Wangers' discovery even more impressive was the cost. In 1970, building a competitive big block was expensive. A good 455 block would cost $200 used. Performance heads were $300, $400. A proper cam was $100. By the time you added pistons, rods, and machine work, you were looking at $2,000 minimum for a serious engine. But the small block approach changed everything. 326 and 350 cores were everywhere and cheap. Nobody wanted them for performance, so junkyards practically gave them away. The heads were the only valuable part, but even those could be found reasonably at swap meets. A complete build could be done for under $500 even with machine work. The performance world started to take notice. Hot rod magazines began featuring small block Pontiac builds. The myth that you needed cubic inches for power was slowly dying. Racers discovered that a well-built 350 could run with big blocks all day long and do it on pump gas. But Pontiac never officially acknowledged this. They continued pushing their big block engines until emissions regulations and insurance costs killed the muscle car era. The 1973 oil crisis was the final nail in the coffin. Suddenly, nobody wanted big blocks anymore. Fuel economy mattered more than quarter-mile times. Ironically, this is when the small block Pontiac really came into its own. As gas prices soared and emission standards tightened, the 350 became Pontiac's Volume V8. It was installed in everything from Firebirds to Grand Prix to Bonnevilles, and enthusiasts who remembered Wangers' formula knew these engines had serious potential. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the Pontiac 350 developed a following among budget racers. While everyone else was focused on Chevy small blocks, smart builders were snatching up Pontiac 350s for pennies. A set of 1969 400 heads, a decent cam, and headers would wake these engines up dramatically. The legacy of Wangers' $85 engine goes beyond just Pontiac. He proved a fundamental truth about internal combustion engines. Airflow matters more than displacement. This concept would revolutionize engine building in the following decades. Today we see 2.0-liter four-cylinders, making 300 horsepower from the factory. That's 150 horsepower per liter or 2.45 horsepower per cubic inch. Modern engines achieve this through superior head design, variable valve timing, and forced induction. But the principle is the same one Wangers discovered in his Illinois garage: make the heads flow, raise the compression, optimize the cam timing, and the power will follow. The story also highlights how manufacturers sometimes suppress information that could hurt their bottom line. Pontiac knew their small blocks could make big power. They had the dyno sheets. They had the flow bench data. But they also had a business model built on selling expensive big block engines. Why tell customers they could go faster for less money? This wasn't unique to Pontiac. Chrysler never advertised that their 340 small block could be built to outrun a 440. Ford didn't mention that a properly built 351 Cleveland could embarrass a 428. The manufacturers wanted to sell their premium engines, and that meant maintaining the mythology that displacement was everything. But racers like Wangers couldn't afford to believe in mythology. They had to find speed wherever they could, and that meant questioning everything. When you're working with an $85 budget, you get creative. You study airflow theory. You understand compression dynamics. You learn what actually makes power versus what the magazines tell you makes power. The technical education that came from builds like this was invaluable. A generation of racers learned that cylinder heads were the key to power. They learned about port velocity, valve sizing, combustion chamber design, and flow bench testing. These lessons would carry forward into the modern era of engine building. Today, Wangers 326 would be considered crude. Modern cylinder heads flow twice what those 389 heads did. Contemporary camshafts have profiles that would have been considered impossible in 1970. Electronic fuel injection and ignition systems optimize every combustion event, but the fundamental principles remain unchanged. The story resonates because it's about more than just engines. It's about a kid with no money outsmarting a giant corporation. It's about questioning authority and conventional wisdom. It's about proving that knowledge and creativity can triumph over cubic dollars and cubic inches. Every time someone builds a high-performance engine on a budget, they're following in Wangers' footsteps. Every time someone questions whether they really need the expensive option, they're channeling that same skepticism. And every time a small block beats a big block at the drag strip, it's a reminder that displacement isn't everything. The Illinois teenager who spent $85 to embarrass Ford's most feared muscle car didn't just build an engine. He exposed a truth that the manufacturers didn't want known. He proved that performance isn't about how much money you spend or how many cubic inches you have. It's about understanding the science, applying it creatively, and having the courage to challenge what everyone knows to be true. That primer gray Firebird running 1240s changed more than just the outcome of a few drag races. It changed how people thought about building power. It democratized performance, showing that speed wasn't just for rich kids with factory supercars. Anyone with knowledge, determination, and $85 could build something extraordinary. The next time you hear someone say you need huge displacement to make power, remember Jim Wangers Jr. and his Junkyard 326. Remember that sometimes the best solution isn't the most expensive one. And remember that somewhere in Illinois, a teenager with a wrench and an idea changed the game forever. What's the most impressive budget build you've ever seen? Drop a comment below and share your own giant killer story. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into outsmarting the establishment with junkyard parts, hit that subscribe button for more legendary engine stories that prove bigger isn't always better.